Well, hello, everyone. And today we are here with Professor Sean Whittaker, who is the Professor of Cutaneous Oncology from Guy's and St. Thomas in London, in the UK. And it's really delightful to have you with us, Professor Whittaker. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, well, thank you, Susan. I'm delighted to join you. I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah, and this is so great because we'll have the chance to get your perspective from cutaneous lymphoma and the clinical side of the European experience and how things have developed and changed. And starting off, I think it would be really interesting, and something I certainly don't know anything about, is how did you get into cutaneous lymphoma and cutaneous oncology? I mean, it's not kind of the highest profile area of study and clinical practice. So if you would be so kind to share with us a little bit about, how'd you navigate here?
Yeah, well, I guess like all things, it makes sense when you look back at it. But when you're actually in the moment, when you're starting a career, you don't actually understand where you're going to go, and events and opportunities occur, don't they? When I wanted to do dermatology, a colleague, I was in Manchester doing cardiothoracic medicine at the time, and I think I was desperate for a change and looking for something different. And once every fortnight, I sat in with a colleague on a Friday afternoon, which I found quite relaxing, but also fascinating because he saw such a diverse pattern of disease, really, and it was such an instructive process, seeing children, adults, etc., all age groups. And I asked his advice about doing dermatology after a while, and he said, go to London and go to the Institute of Dermatology at St. John's. And so that's what I did, and was fortunate enough to start at a time when there were some fabulous colleagues, senior colleagues, and there were a lot of specialist services, and I got involved in the cutaneous lymphoma service at that time. And I went off to do some research on the subject for a number of years, a doctorate, and then came back to the Institute and carried on with developing my interest in the cutaneous oncology. So it makes sense when you look back, but of course, at the beginning, you're just looking for opportunities and things that interest you and where you feel you can make a difference, really. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we're so glad that you found that pathway through here. So over the years, I mean, you've been in clinical practice and doing research for a while, right? What have you seen the changes from when you first began in clinical practice in London, in the UK? What was that like? And then what have you seen the migration to where we are today in the research and the clinical practice even?
Yeah, well, I think in terms of the clinical practice, there's, thank goodness, a really much better holistic care for patients. When I look back many years ago, it's a bit daunting to see that the care was around a medical environment, a diagnosis, a treatment, but the patients were not supported in other ways. So I think one of the big improvements has been the role of clinical nurse specialists and pathway coordinators helping patients through the difficulty in coping with a complex illness. Psychology input, etc. None of that existed. All of that is there in this day and age, which is excellent. And actually, it's a model we picked up from the US, actually, because we, almost 20 years ago, we visited the US centers, etc., and came back not only for our cutaneous oncology lymphoma patients, but also for other cancers, breast, lung, etc. And we took some of what we perceived as the best practice and embedded that back in our system. And at the same time, our health service was changing as well, and recognizing that, of course, that sort of multidisciplinary care for patients was really important. And it's quite extraordinary sometimes to see the amount of time that colleagues spend with patients, supporting them in those roles. So I think in terms of holistic care, that's a huge change. In terms of cutaneous lymphoma, we have more treatments off the back of improved and better trials, and over, again, 20, 25, even longer years, it actually, you see the quality of the trials has improved, the data, and therefore the evidence base for those complicated treatments which some patients embark on has led to much more approval of newer agents. So the options for treatment are much greater. And that's a big change from a medical perspective. In terms of our research, I mean, it's obviously a complex area and part of my life. Our understanding of the disease is hugely improved in terms of the depth of knowledge. And the challenge now, of course, is using that knowledge to, I think, first of all, identify better treatments for patients. And that's a must, particularly for advanced stages of disease. And secondly, utilizing that knowledge to be able to predict patients' course and to provide better evidence that a patient may have a very low risk of any problems and therefore can be more reassured. And those patients who may be at higher risk can then have an escalated form of treatment. So I think those are the two key challenges at the moment. And that's a lot of work going on around the world in the centers that are interested in have good research programs in that area anyway.
Yeah.
So does that answer the question?
Well, there's always I think that gives folks a broad view, right, of how things have evolved and changed. And I think one of the things I've had the opportunity, as you know, to visit your clinic and meet several of your nurse practitioners. And I think one of the, at least as far as I have seen, one of the unique things that you do at Guy's in St. Thomas with the cutaneous lymphoma clinic is having the psychologists actually as part of the team. They're not a separate, well, they may be doing other things, but they really are integrated into your practice. And maybe you can talk a little bit about how that came about, because I think in this particular disease, given the chronic nature of it, right? So people are living with it for a long time, and the physicality of it, that has such a huge impact, even if from a patient perspective, your disease is being well managed, there's still all of these other, as you mentioned, kind of these other pieces, the holistic part. And I think you have brilliantly incorporated that in a way that's really unique. I haven't seen that in any other center as proactively as you have really put that together.
Well, I think firstly, there's a little bit of luck with this sort of process. As you know, the demands on resources and healthcare are limited. But I was able to utilize a sort of an advantage in that setting in terms of the service management to embed a post. And the post has grown into 2 posts that support not only our cutaneous lymphoma, but also our melanoma service as well. And the demands of patients, as you've highlighted, are very different in the 2 services, actually. And that's noticeable. The other main driver was some work we did with a palliative care consultant who had an interest in quality of life. And with Teresa Bainen's support, we've published quite a few papers working with carers as well as the patients in terms of their issues, the needs that they have. And that was part of the justification for the psychology argument. But ultimately, like everything, you have to fight for the resources as well. And we're fortunate. Our cancer center actually has psychology support, but it's not, as you've just said, centered embedded in the service. It's provided as an opportunity. So patients may not access it in the same way. So it's really important. And some patients with early stage disease who we may feel are not at major risk, of course, have huge issues because of the physicality of the disease. That has an enormous impact on a patient's quality of life and how they're perceived, their relationships. It's very, very important. And that's a very specific need around cutaneous lymphoma. So it's a great benefit. We want to keep them involved in the service, and they've managed to contribute to significant papers and studies with carers as well, which have influenced regulatory authorities. So when a drug is approved, or we have a thing in the UK called NICE, which a drug is approved by the licensing authorities, but then it has to go through NICE, National Institute for Clinical Excellence. So it's a wonderful name, but it is a big hurdle. And there are cost issues, economic modeling, but the most important thing there that the regulatory authority they look at is, of course, the patient voice. And so the input of psychologists, the input of papers on the quality of care is very important in that realm. But most important, it's crucial for family and patients. So we're very lucky and fortunate, and they do a great job.
Yes, I can attest to that, and feel very privileged to have had the opportunity to participate and be there and get to know the folks, and I just think it's great. And you brought up I think a really good point around pulling together the data and what we've learned. I think both on the clinical side. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what you've seen, I think really more recently, especially with the large consortium that has come together through all of the expert centers around the world, collecting that data, because, if you've got something from one center, that's good, but when you can pull the data together, do an analysis and look at it from that clinical research eye, and then have the opportunity to address it and have conversations amongst the experts on, well, what does this mean? And then how do we extrapolate it? What do we do with that? Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, because I think that has really moved quickly in the last many years, maybe because of technology and other things. But the clinical community globally has really come together strongly, at least from where I sit, which most patients don't get to see that piece, but it's so important, the work that's being done kind of behind the scenes.
Yes. Well, I think historically, interested groups gathered together, both in Europe and the US. Because it's a rare area of medicine, there was always awareness and collaboration to an extent, but it was somewhat limited. And where we've fortunately been able to move to over the last, again, probably 20 years, is a real collaborative effort between European centers that have come together, the so-called EORTC, which is focused around cutaneous lymphoma, both experts in dermatology, oncology, radiotherapy, as well as pathology. And a lot of important work around classification has been done, and treatment guidelines, etc. But the US colleagues were doing similar effort with the US CLC, and there was a group of colleagues who set up the International Society for Cutaneous Lymphoma, and we had quite a debate about 15 years ago about what was the role of all this. Because if you're not careful, you can end up with lots of siloed activity, and competitive element comes into play, etc. And of course, that was not of any value in this area. and so the ISCL, the International Society for Cutaneous Lymphoma, has become an umbrella for the European and the US, and indeed other groups. South America have a group, Asia has a group that's emerging, and Australasia has joined in. So now you've got a world collective, as it were. And what that has enabled is the opportunity to develop prospective studies, as you're alluding to, in the ProClippy study is a big one, across the community. And that, of course, is gathering very crucial data from patients at diagnosis and patients' progress through their pathway. And by doing that prospectively across a whole geography, a large geography, we get much, much more accurate information. The numbers are bigger. There's no skewing based on an artificial skewing of interpretation based on very localized views, which can always be the case. And so there's been a lot of work comparing treatment approaches. There's been a merging really of treatment guidelines between Europe and US, which is good news. That's best for patients because that's a very strong consensus of what is best and appropriate. And of course, it leads to sharing of research projects and opportunities to compare and confirm data, which is very important. I think everybody during COVID has recognized that the media can skew anything, and that's a great danger in medicine. So by having a large collective focusing on it, you will get much more accurate information, and there's agreement about it as well. So that effort has been led by many, many colleagues, and is undoubtedly important for patients. And I'm sure you're right, patients don't see that. It's invisible, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
But it's really crucial, particularly in a rare disease.
Yeah. So maybe just kind of taking that thread a little bit, what have you seen change in clinical practice over the years based on therapies or based on the data that's been collected and discussed? How have you seen treatment pathways or practices change or modify?
Well, I think there's been a significant shift away from treating all patients with a chemotherapy regimen. Mm-hmm. We understand that's not appropriate. It's not effective for the vast majority of patients and has obviously a lot of morbidity and toxicity for patients. And if that's not curative, the question then is, well, what's the benefit of trying that approach? And that's one major change. Now, the other change is recognizing where treatment needs to be escalated. And if you have a view that, well, early stage, I'm talking predominantly about mycosis fungoides, but if we have a situation where early stage disease is thought not to be associated with any risk for patients, there's a tendency for physicians to step back and not intervene. And that's equally problematic. We now have lots of different treatments. The trial data that is a collective international effort has shown those treatments and shown where we can use them, when we should use them, and how we use them safely. And then at the very difficult end of the spectrum, where patients have a disease that is advancing and really causing significant risk for the patient, as well as real misery, we obviously do have to escalate our treatments. And I think the treatment that's made a big difference from my perspective for patients has been the stem cell transplant programs that have been led from major centers around the world. It's only appropriate for a limited number of patients. That's the first thing to say. But there has been significant success. It's not the perfect solution, but it is remarkable. One of our patients is now 17 years after a stem cell transplant and he's been in remission for 16 of those 17 years. And that is extraordinary to see. It's what you want to achieve. And of course, if we go back over 20 years ago, we couldn't achieve that. So I think that's a sort of broad, hopefully a broad answer for your question, Susan. It's a difficult question, actually.
Yeah, well, and I think, this disease is complex because of the broadness. You have early stage mycosis fungoides patients who usually don't progress, right? So you're trying to treat more palliatively, really.
Yeah.
And then for those folks that have more challenging disease, it is hard because this disease is really smart. It figures out how to maneuver. And, I think that's one of the really critical messages we are hoping to get out to the patients is, when you're sitting here as a patient and you want all of those black and white answers. Tell me what I have, how you're going to treat it, how you're going to get rid of it. What are my options? And this disease is so challenging because there aren't a lot of those kinds of answers. And, I go back to, I think having that psychological support to help people wrap their head around that is so important. And I think that, again, that's the role that we play as the patient organization, kind of a landing place for folks where they can ask the kinds of questions they forgot to ask, or they were not comfortable asking, or they didn't understand the medical terminology, to help have that kind of better dialogue. Because, quite frankly, when you're diagnosed, at least I know for me, you end up kind of in a marriage with your clinician, hopefully until they retire, which I've had 2 of my specialists retire on me, and that is just not very fair.
I think I know them as well.
Yes, you do. And, but I think actually that's another question. And what I was so excited about, and I know we were together at the last World Congress just before the world shut down in COVID in 2020 in Barcelona. And I was so excited and blown away to see the number of researchers, clinicians, but the younger folks that are coming into the field. It seems, I was just so encouraged. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, because you've seen kind of the evolution.
Yeah, it is marvelous. There's a huge bank of younger colleagues coming into the area. And I think that's different to maybe 15 years ago, where it felt a little bit less interesting for people, which is very frustrating. And you need to see a critical mass internationally to drive progress. I think being optimistic, progress is close, and we are going to see significant change. And I think we'll see some more novel treatments emerging, CAR T therapies, for example. There are already signs that there may be opportunities there, and a number of studies looking at that. It's highly complex. It's only going to be appropriate for very few patients. Again, that's not what we really need to find as an option. And again, I'm focusing on advanced disease. I think we will have much more insight into predicting risk for patients. That's probably going to emerge over the next 2 years, I think. And that will be based on analysis of tissue material, etc., and blood. But I think that will emerge. And that will be very helpful, because it will enable us to identify those group of patients who do need to have treatment escalated more at an early, possibly a sort of slightly earlier stage, but equally to provide confident reassurance that everything we understand clinically can be backed up by science to indicate that the patient is going to be okay. and it is extremely unlikely for them to ever have a problem. And that sort of balance is really, really crucial. And I think again, this is a bit blue sky thinking, but it's certainly where we are at the moment in terms of clinical research, is understanding that this is not a disease that's going to be cured by a single treatment. You mentioned it perfectly. This disease is very clever. Its ability to have different resistant parts to the disease that emerge after treatments is very obvious to us as clinicians, and the patients can tell us that. They see it and they understand what's happening. So what we have to look for is the Achilles heel for this. And there are encouraging signs in other forms of cancer, breast cancer is one, where those Achilles heels have been found. So cancer cells, if I may just broaden the discussion a bit, cancer cells obviously have to evolve to survive. And to do that, they need to create a lot of error in DNA, etc. But in so doing, they open themselves up to drug treatments that are what we call tumor agnostic. In other words, it's not a specific cancer, works across cancer, because you can cause more damage, which makes the cell absolutely useless and the cancer cell dies off. We already have that paradigm in breast cancer and other cancers. And there are signs that CTCL has the same sort of Achilles heel. And we need to do quite a lot more work. And ultimately, of course, it's all about trials with the relevant drugs. But that sort of approach might be a window to making a big difference, because our conventional approaches are struggling, with a few exceptions, such as stem cell transplant. Whether those treatments will be appropriate or necessary for early stage, low risk disease, of course, is very unclear at the moment. But we hopefully will learn more. I hope that, I'm sorry if that may be a bit complicated.
No, I think that's really wonderful, because what is so exciting to me is the work that's being done to try to understand the differences in an individual's disease and who and when their disease may be progressing, because, you know, as we know, the nice thing is that it shows up on the skin, but by the time something shows up on the skin that looks like it's progressing, that if we can get ahead of that, right, and understand what are we looking for that may predict a probability for this particular patient, so you can keep an eye on things. And I know there's some interesting diagnostics that are coming forward using newer technologies, which allow us to get a better feel for what's happening at that cellular level before it shows up in the symptomology of the disease, which, you know, if we could figure that out, I think from a patient perspective, that for those folks that can have a better sense that their disease is more of the chronic, we can manage that, but it isn't going to turn into a life-threatening situation, makes it a little bit easier to wrap your head around that.
Yeah,
right.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But go ahead.
And the diagnostics are changing rapidly, along with other, not unique to CTCL, whole genome sequencing, which we will have available in November for patients with advanced CTCL. That's an extraordinary, that's in the diagnostic setting, not a research setting. The wealth of data that will be generated and the ability to actually personalize patients' risk, potentially patients' treatment over the next few years will come off that. And that will, the chance of success there is reasonably high. It's not a false dawn. I mean, I know that from a patient perspective, scientific progress sometimes seems very archaic and removed from where it matters, but across most cancer types, actually, the progress now is real for patients, and it's moving at a great pace. What we have to do in CTCL is make sure patients with CTCL are on the same escalator as that work that's going on in other areas, and that is beginning to happen. So I'm optimistic that the progress is escalating at a rate now, not just progressing at the same rate. And I think, and again, it gets back to your point about the international community working together, and that's happening, and undoubtedly will be of huge benefit in ensuring that we're on the escalator. So
yeah, that's really exciting because, you know, having, and I know you know a little bit of my history, but living with this disease for 30 years, oh gosh, I'm giving away my age now, but but you know, and I was in that small percentage of people whose disease progressed, and we didn't have a lot of options back then in the late 90s. So, you know, I feel very lucky that I managed to get to an expert in the field, and that, you know, he worked with other colleagues in radiation oncology and so forth. And I was very lucky, I think. A lot to your point, luck sometimes plays a role. But, you know, the opportunity now to really move forward is really exciting. But let me ask you this question. Where do you see, what's the biggest question we need to answer to really, or a series of questions, right? To really move things forward in a way that has that kind of impact. I mean, you spoke a little bit about the diagnostics and how we can hopefully in the next couple of years do a better job of understanding whose disease is functioning in which way, and clinical trials and treatments and those things. But what else do you see, the kinds of questions that we need to be addressing?
Well, I think patients with early stage disease often struggle to get a diagnosis for quite a long time. And, you know, that's hugely demoralizing for them. And I'm sure causes a lot of anxiety when they finally have a diagnosis. And of course, the first question they're going to ask is, well, am I sort of adversely affected by this delay in my diagnosis? With early stage disease, probably not, which is reassuring, but it's not ideal because patients want to have a clear diagnosis within a reasonable time frame from their doctor. So I think that's still a challenge. And you know, I even saw a patient this morning, actually, exactly that scenario, over 6 or 7 years, and he was sort of astonished, really. So that's one big issue. And again, that's more about education of our dermatological community, but in the UK also our primary care physicians who act as a gatekeeper for our public health service. And that's hard for a general practitioner, primary care physician, to understand this disease. But of course, it's about referring patients promptly when it doesn't behave as expected. So that's very important for patients. In terms of, we've mentioned the ability to stratify risk for patients more accurately, and that will emerge. The clear need is in the advanced disease setting where, and you've had a good response, Susan, and previously, and have done so well. But of course, not everybody achieves that. So the question then is, what can we do in that situation? So that's a big issue and a big concern. I've mentioned some of the optimistic views about the future. Tackling that advanced disease setting has to be the priority for us. From a clinical academic standpoint, we have to be able to improve those outcomes. T-cell lymphomas in general are difficult. It's not just cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. If they affect lymph node tissues, internal tissues, and don't affect the skin at all, they're equally difficult to treat. And I think the hemato-oncology community, as well as the dermatology and radiation oncology community, are recognizing that there has to be a major focus around T-cell lymphoma. And there are some good initiatives pushing that agenda. Interest from companies is increased enormously, from biotech and pharma. All of that is critical because they always look for the gap, the need, the unmet need, and that's very important. So I'm optimistic. It is the big challenge is making sure that patients with advanced disease, have good outcomes like yourself and other patients. That's what we've got to achieve, and it's really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more as we speak to people, who have traveled that journey of misdiagnosis, even in more advanced disease. And what do you think we can do better? I think one of the challenges, and we're trying to understand what is the landscape kind of globally for cutaneous lymphomas in the different regions. Where are the specialists located? What are the treatments available by country? Once you get into Europe, it depends on the country. As you pointed out, it's approvals by potentially the regulators for a new treatment, but then it becomes part of each country decides how they will incorporate that, or if they will put it on their available treatment lists, and we get into the economics of all of that. But it's such a daunting challenge, I think, when you consider, to your point, in the UK, the GPs are the gatekeepers and they're looking at all diseases. So how the heck do you figure out, how do you support them to know when they need to refer to a dermatologist? And then once within the dermatology ranks, or even hematology, quite frankly, at times, when they need to refer to an expert in this particular very rare disease, because we've seen it. I know you've seen it as well with patients that have come through your doors that have kind of gone through this journey, and had maybe they've been able to travel faster, it could have made a difference. Sometimes not, but maybe, right? Any ideas or thoughts?
Well, big questions. I think firstly,
questions. I'm sorry.
No. I think it does vary from country to country. There are some positive signs. For example, the internet is helping, and you're doing a great job with the Cutaneous Lymphoma Foundation, because if patients have a diagnosis and they're uncomfortable or unsure of whether they're being, they're in the right environment, then access to that through the internet is proving enormously. It's almost driving. The patient takes control, really, and the patient starts to drive the agenda. And of course, they also realize that they're not unique. They can liaise with other patients, which is fantastic, and they always find that helpful, I know. So that's a positive move. I think I can't speak easily for every other country. I mean, obviously in the UK, primary care is a potential block. If the primary care physician does not refer the patient, they can be in a difficult situation. But equally, they can challenge the doctor and say, well, have I got this? Some patients are not quite diagnosing themselves, but they're able to access an enormous amount of information. So that's positive. We have, in a national health service, the rather bizarre system introduces some delays, etc., but it also produces a good structure. So if a patient has a diagnosis of MF in the UK that's proven, that is supposed to be discussed at a specialist multidisciplinary team meeting. And if that diagnosis is made, they then have a referral pathway to a specialist regional centre. So in other words, the process can actually push through the referral very effectively. So the paradox is it can be very accurate, and the patient then gets to the right centre with the right expertise and the right multidisciplinary team to look after them. So we have, and again, I suspect every country has different issues. So we have the paradox of being able to get to where you need to be if your biopsy is discussed at a specialist multidisciplinary team meeting, which should be triggered automatically. But the entry point is tricky in the UK.
Yeah, and I don't think that's that much different in some of the other countries. What I'm hopeful is we will, through our collaboration with the Lymphoma Coalition, which is an umbrella patient advocacy organization of all lymphoma groups globally, and we do every other year a global patient survey. And we've been able to, this year we've added some additional specific questions for cutaneous lymphoma. And in the last 2 years, we've had enough cutaneous lymphoma patients answer the survey to pull our subset disease out. And we can then compare against the other lymphomas, the patient experience, but then we can also, I'm hoping this next year when we launch in January, that we will be able to do a better job of communicating about the survey to the clinicians in the different countries. They can encourage their patients. We do it in multiple languages so people can answer. And then to be able to pull that data, and then we can slice and dice it to see, well, what's different in the UK? It might be different in France. What's different in, maybe in Serbia, because some of the Eastern European countries, have different challenges because there may not even be any experts in cutaneous lymphoma in the whole country. So then how do people navigate? And I think, at least that's my vision, is to do this global landscape analysis and then to be able to pull the pieces out and then collaborate in the geographies and with the different stakeholders in the countries to say, okay, here's the status of cutaneous lymphoma in the UK, for example. How do we then work together with the clinical community, with our friends at Lymphoma Action, which is the big lymphoma patient advocacy group, to do a better job of helping patients navigate and also bringing that patient experience to the regulators, to the governments, to say, you've got to look beyond perhaps what's on the paper. From here's the patient experience, and here's people in your country that are really impacted.
Susan, you're having a great deal of success. I mean, we noticed after our meeting in London in 2017, I think, the huge change from the National Lymphoma Association, which you invited to the meeting, and they met you, and they realized with the patient group that this was important, and they were neglecting it a little bit. It was a less common form of lymphoma, and that's been really positive. And in terms of regulatory approval, their presence, their advocacy for the patients has been phenomenal. I've sat in on a few of those regulatory NICE meetings. So, and that has a huge impact in terms of regulatory approval for new drugs, which we're seeing. So very, very important, and there's no substitute for it, I think. And giving patients confidence that they're not alone is really important. And as you say, navigating signposting as best as you can. It's a big task, though, across a whole continent of diverse languages, etc.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
that's great.
we're
It really is
starting.
marvelous. Yeah.
I think, gosh, I'm looking at the landscape and the activity in the clinical trial realm, but we also know that, especially when you're talking about more advanced disease, the populations that are eligible to participate in a clinical trial, we need to do international clinical trials, which then raises the cost of the trial, right? And the companies tend to be smaller because it's a rare disease. You're not talking, most of the companies in our space are not the big pharmas that everybody knows about. So they're trying to get funding to support their clinical trial. And I think trying to let the patients know about what trials are available so that they can interact with their clinicians in a way, I hope help with that process. And then on the back end, once we get through the clinical trial process and it is a good therapy, how do we then make sure that it becomes available in the countries? Because if we get through the trial process and then you can't use it, then why do we just do that? That makes no sense, at least from my layperson's perspective.
I think that's a great strategy. That's absolutely ideal. And we're seeing that it's working, Susan. So, the Lymphoma Foundation is doing a great job in supporting the patients, and directing to trials is really important. And it's not an easy thing for the patients to navigate there, because I think the internet, it's not easy to access current clinical trials through just on the web. It's not that straightforward, very complicated. So facilitating that for patients' awareness and raising awareness is really important. Of course, if the patient's getting to the center, they should know, and they should know what access to trials are available. And we always need more trials for CTCL, without a doubt. I think where I would like to see a pivot is a little bit more around investigator-led trials. Pharma and biotech have fantastic resources and inevitably drive the agenda. But I think we need to just pivot a little bit more cleverly to investigator-led studies that or effectively can build on some of the points I made earlier about these novel therapies looking for the Achilles heel, which are not what you might call, are not necessarily identifying CTCL as an opportunity. But by using investigator-led early phase studies, we can possibly create that opportunity. I think that's possibly where I would have a subtle change of direction for the community, and hopefully that will happen over the next few years.
That's really good. And another point too, one of our other initiatives is trying to raise funding through the patient community to support that kind of research that is hard to get funding for, that may or may not be tied directly to a new treatment, but understanding some of these other components that you spoke about. There's so much competition for funding for those kinds of studies. And if we in the patient community can help to facilitate some of that work, I don't know how we're going to do it, but our big goal is our research advisory council said, well, in our perspective, we're probably a good 15 years behind the B-cell lymphomas in understanding the disease. And what would really make a difference is if you could offer, $10,000, $100,000 multi-year grant. So if you could raise $1 million a year that could then be delivered directly to the cutaneous lymphoma clinical research arena, that would move us forward much faster. So that's our big goal. I don't know if we'll ever get there, but we're sure going to try our best. And we just closed this last round of funding, and we had we only had enough for 2 grants, but Professor Pietro Coglino from Italy was one, and I'm trying to remember, Oh, the other one was from Germany. So really exciting if we can rally our own, again, another reason to pull the patient community together. And we're all part of this, right? We all play a role. So
Yeah,
you know,
and those resources will really be needed, because taking some more novel approach to treating in early phase studies inevitably hits a point when you need additional resource. So it's really, really important, Susan, and you know, huge thanks to all the patients who donate and help with the fundraising, because it's a phenomenal effort.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, it's in our best interest, right? Personal best interest. So I know I've kept you here for a little bit. So here's my one of my last and final questions, although I will say it may not be my last. It depends on how you answer. But, you know, if, you know, looking at your crystal ball, and if you had a magic wand, you know, what would the future look like, say, in 3 to 5 years from now? What would you love to see?
Well, yeah, that's a big one as well, isn't it? So I think the first answer to that, I'll split early stage and advanced stage, because I think they're different.
Yeah.
For early stage disease, we need a safe treatment that alleviates symptoms and resolves rash. When it comes back, you can reuse the same treatment and have good control. Now, the current methods are a bit of a mess for lots of reasons, whether it's phototherapy requiring frequent attendances, whether it's topical treatments which aren't really completely effective. So the crystal ball would say that our better understanding of disease would enable us to have a better treatment to control and manage that disease safely for patients. And therefore their quality of life is better. They know and they have confidence that their disease is unlikely to progress. And so they're managed safely with that better treatment. What that will be is a little bit more tricky to identify, of course, but that's got to be a critical aim and aspiration. I think for advanced disease, we need treatments that produce the excellent results you see in B-cell lymphoma, where patients can have bulky disease and go into remission, but most importantly, the remission is durable. It doesn't mean that patients will always be in remission, but they have complete remissions which are durable long-term. And I'd use the analogy of melanoma, where when I started doing melanoma clinics, which I still do, the prognosis was dreadful for patients who had stage 4 melanoma. It was a terrible scenario. Now, patients with stage 4 melanoma, over 55 to 60% are in complete remission at 5 years with stage 4 melanoma, on the basis of progress in immunotherapies, etc., and targeted therapies. We couldn't have imagined that 20 years ago. And that progress, that's where we have to get to for advanced disease and advanced CTCL. Durable long-term remission has to be the aim.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. So, okay, I said I wasn't quite sure if that was my last question. So here's my last question, I promise. So for all the patients who are watching our chat today, what would be some final thoughts or wisdom you'd like to share with them?
Well, for early stage disease, I often use a fairly simplistic bit of guidance in the clinics, and that I tell patients the skin is the best indicator of what's going on. So if the skin is quiet and they have early stage disease, nothing is going to happen. They can be reassured. If the skin rash is same, fluctuating mildly, subtly, that's reassuring. It is good news. It's the change in the pattern behavior of the skin and the presence of different rash and extent of rash that is the triggers for something's changing in the disease. So the skin is the best indicator of what's going on for early stage disease. And I don't know if that reassures every patient. I know they have to cope with ongoing symptoms and recurrences and flares, etc. But for me, it's the best bit of advice I can provide for early stage disease. And for advanced disease, we have hope, and the hope is around controlling and managing the advanced stages of disease and considering options, either trials or options such as new drugs such as brentuximab, which have been proving to be very helpful. And for some patients, stem cell transplants and other more dramatic interventions, but can have the benefit of that long-term remission, as I mentioned earlier. It's a different set of questions, different set of advice, of course, for the two groups. And I think that's important to recognize as well.
Yeah, and I think you said that so beautifully. You know, not everyone in this disease falls into the same bucket. So it really is different depending upon where you land in the spectrum of disease. But I'm very excited and hopeful for the future. And I just thank you so much for taking the time to share your perspective and your thoughts with everybody today. It's been an honor and a pleasure to have you with us. And I hope maybe I'll tap you again in the future.
Well, thank you, Susan. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for inviting me.
Great. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye.